Leon the Ghost Dempsey and Cian Reilly were two names that once ruled Dublin's streets, one built on silence, the other on chaos. But when pride clashed with precision, their war ignited a storm so violent it reshaped Ireland's underworld forever. Dublin in the early 2000s was a city split in two. On the surface it was a place of growth and pride, where new businesses opened and young people dreamed of a better life. But beneath that new shine, another Dublin thrived, one ruled by fear, silence, and money made in the shadows. The drug trade was the heartbeat of this world, feeding both greed and violence. Every neighborhood had someone collecting, someone watching, and someone ready to do whatever it took to keep control. Among the names whispered in that world, one stood out: Leon the Ghost Dempsey. He wasn't the loudest or the richest, but he was the one everyone respected. Dempsey had built his empire with patience and precision. He didn't waste words or make scenes. He believed that power was about control of people, of information, and of fear. When rivals bragged about their latest deals, Dempsey stayed in the background, quietly making sure his operations ran smoother than anyone else's. His men followed strict rules: no unnecessary violence, no attention, and no talking to anyone outside the circle. He treated his business like a military campaign, and that's why it worked. For years his name rarely appeared in police reports, and no one could connect him directly to any crime. The Gardaí knew he existed, but had little to hold against him. He was a ghost, both feared and untouchable. Then, in 2008, everything changed. It started with a single shipment, one container that was supposed to arrive quietly at Dublin port. Inside were drugs worth nearly €2 million. The operation had been planned for months, with everyone playing their part, but when the truck arrived at the storage yard, the container was empty. The guards at the gate had seen nothing, and the security footage had somehow been erased. It was as if the cargo had vanished into thin air. Dempsey was known for his calm, but those close to him said he didn't speak for almost 2 days after the news broke. Losing that much money wasn't just a financial hit, it was an insult, a public challenge to his authority. Rumors began to spread fast. Some said a rival gang had hijacked the shipment. Others whispered about a betrayal from within. But one name came up again and again: Cian Reilly. Reilly was the opposite of Dempsey in every way. Loud, reckless, and unpredictable. He had built his reputation on fear rather than respect. He was young and hungry, eager to make his mark. Taking Dempsey's shipment would have been a dangerous move, but it would also make him famous in the underworld. No one knew for sure if Reilly was behind it, but in Dublin's criminal circles, rumors were as deadly as bullets. People started choosing sides, sensing a storm coming. Even those who had stayed neutral began preparing for what everyone knew was inevitable: a war for control of the city's underworld. What none of them realized was that Dempsey wasn't planning a quick strike or a loud revenge. He was waiting, watching, calculating every step, because when the ghost finally decided to move, it would not be chaos. It would be quiet, precise, and final. When money disappeared, trust vanished with it. The stolen shipment didn't just cost Leon Dempsey millions. It fractured the fragile balance that had kept Dublin's criminal world from tearing itself apart. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread faster than the truth. Every gang member, every middleman, every dealer wanted to know what the ghost would do next. Some expected immediate retaliation, a public show of power to remind everyone who really controlled the streets. But Dempsey didn't move. His silence was more frightening than any threat could have been. Behind that silence, however, he was far from idle. Dempsey began to map out the situation with his usual precision. He studied who was meeting with who, which shipments were changing hands, and which of his men were acting nervous. He noticed that certain dealers were suddenly flush with cash, and a few of his oldest contacts had gone quiet. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just fear. Loyalty was beginning to crack. The ghost's reputation had kept people in line for years, but now, a new name was gaining power: Cian Reilly. Reilly had risen quickly, too quickly for comfort. He came from the north side, where violence was currency and chaos was normal. To him Dempsey represented the old way, calm, secretive, and methodical. Reilly wanted to rule through intimidation. He offered instant wealth and protection, things young men with nothing to lose couldn't resist. He promised a new order, one where anyone could rise fast if they were willing to pull a trigger. It was an empire built on fear and greed, and for a while it worked. Dealers who once paid Dempsey for protection began switching sides. Smugglers refused to move his shipments. Even some of his lieutenants started meeting Reilly's men in backrooms and bars. Every betrayal was a cut that Dempsey silently recorded, one by one. He didn't lash out. Instead, he gathered names, faces, routines, everything he needed to make sure that when he finally struck, there would be no mistakes. Meanwhile, Reilly's confidence grew. He paraded through Dublin's clubs surrounded by new money and false loyalty. Expensive suits, loud cars, and constant attention became his trademarks. He wanted everyone to know he had taken what was once untouchable, but with every boast, every reckless display, he made himself more visible, to the police, to his enemies, and most dangerously, to Dempsey. The Gardaí began to take notice of the tension building in the city. Surveillance teams quietly followed known associates, listening for whispers of an impending war. But in the underworld, nothing was spoken openly. Threats were delivered through stares, coded messages, and sudden disappearances. By late summer the city was divided. The north side fell under Reilly's chaotic rule, while the south remained loyal to Dempsey's fading empire. Every alley, every pub, and every backroom felt charged with silent hostility. The peace that had held for years was gone. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew what was coming. For now, Dempsey waited in the shadows. He watched Reilly's men grow careless. He saw the arrogance spreading like rot through their ranks. Patience had always been his greatest weapon, and he was sharpening it for the moment that would define his legacy. When the ghost finally decided to act, there would be no warning, no second chances, only silence, and then the storm. The first sign that Liam Dempsey was ready to move came quietly, almost unnoticed. It began with a single body found at dawn in an industrial estate on the outskirts of Dublin. The man was a warehouse foreman, someone no one would have thought mattered much. He wasn't high-ranking or rich, just another cog in the machine. But to those who understood the underworld, his death sent a message more powerful than any words. The scene was calm, methodical, and strangely clean. No chaos, no mistakes. It was unmistakably the work of the ghost. For years, Dempsey had built his reputation on precision, and this was his reminder that he was still in control. He didn't need noise or numbers to prove his power. One silent strike, perfectly executed, was enough to freeze the city in place. Those who knew the foreman's connection to the missing shipment understood immediately what it meant. The message was simple: Dempsey hadn't forgotten, and he hadn't forgiven. But while the hit restored some of his aura, it also lit a fire under Cian Reilly. To him, the killing wasn't a warning, it was an insult. He saw it as Dempsey's desperate attempt to hold on to fading power. Reilly's pride wouldn't allow silence. Within days, his men began pushing deeper into Dempsey's territory. Dealers who refused to pay Reilly's new tax were beaten, some disappearing altogether. Stash houses once belonging to Dempsey's crew were raided and looted. It was reckless, but that was how Reilly operated. The city's criminal balance started to crumble. Smaller gangs tried to stay neutral, pretending to do business with both sides, but it was impossible. Every choice carried a risk. Those who leaned toward Reilly gained money and momentum, while those who stayed with Dempsey clung to discipline and fear. Every corner of Dublin seemed to be listening, waiting, and wondering which side would fall first. The Gardaí noticed the shift. Detectives monitoring phone calls and movements could feel something dangerous building. Yet despite the tension, no one could predict when or where the next hit would come. The silence before violence became a daily routine, an endless waiting game. In the background, Dempsey moved carefully. He didn't respond to Reilly's provocations or to the attacks on his operations. His calmness made people nervous. The men who worked for him began to realize that he wasn't finished. He was planning something larger, something final. For Dempsey, revenge wasn't about emotion. It was about restoring order. When a courier vanished one night on his way to deliver cash, and a stash house in Finglas was burned to the ground days later, fear spread faster than truth. Everyone blamed everyone else. No one trusted anyone anymore. The underworld, once organized and predictable, was slipping into chaos. But in that chaos, Dempsey saw opportunity. He had always believed that fear was most effective when no one knew where it would land next. He wanted Reilly to feel watched, to feel hunted, even when nothing was happening. Each disappearance, each whisper, each sleepless night would wear him down piece by piece. And as the streets filled with tension, as Dublin's nightclubs and safe houses became battlegrounds of suspicion, Dempsey remained unseen, silent, patient, and closer than anyone realized. The ghost was moving again, and the city could feel it. The violence that everyone had been dreading finally arrived, one cold October night. It started outside a dimly lit bar in Finglas, a place where gang members often met under the illusion of safety. One of Liam Dempsey's most trusted lieutenants, a man named Patrick "Patsy" Kavanagh, had been there for a quiet drink after a long week of tense negotiations. He was careful, always checking who came and went, always sitting with his back to the wall. But that night, even his caution couldn't save him. As he stepped out into the chill of the evening, two cars appeared from nowhere. The attack was fast and merciless. Automatic gunfire shattered the silence of the narrow street. Patsy didn't even have time to draw his weapon. The time the shooters sped away, he was gone, his body lying in the glow of the streetlights. Witnesses scattered before the police arrived, but everyone in Dublin knew who had ordered it. Cian, Trigger Reilly, had finally made his move, and it was brutal. The murder sent shockwaves through the underworld. Kavanagh wasn't just a soldier, he was one of Dempsey's oldest allies, a man who had kept the organization steady when others were turning greedy. His death was personal. It was Reilly's way of announcing that the old rules no longer applied, that no one connected to the ghost was safe anymore. For Dempsey's crew, it felt like a declaration of war. In the hours that followed, phones burned with encrypted messages, safe houses were cleared, meetings cancelled, and every known associate of Dempsey went into hiding. Yet the one person no one could reach was Dempsey himself. He had vanished. His home was empty, his usual haunts abandoned, his car missing. The Gardaí assumed he had fled the country. Some said he'd gone to Spain to meet contacts there. Others claimed he was hiding in the countryside, regrouped. The truth was that nobody knew, and that uncertainty made the city restless. Reilly took Dempsey's silence as proof of victory. He began showing up at pubs and clubs once considered off-limits, laughing loudly, toasting to the new order. He told people the ghost was gone, finished, nothing more than a story. His confidence grew with every day that passed without retaliation. His men followed his example, moving through Dempsey's old territories with arrogance, assuming the war was already won. But Dublin's underworld had a long memory, and silence rarely meant surrender. Unknown to Reilly, Dempsey was still there, hidden in plain sight, watching everything unfold. He moved carefully, relying on a small circle of men who had never betrayed him. Every boast Reilly made, every deal he celebrated, every face that joined his ranks, Dempsey took note of it all. The hit on Kavanagh had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Dempsey knew he couldn't gently strike back in anger that would only fuel Reilly's reputation. He needed something bigger, something final. So, as Reilly celebrated his supposed victory, Dempsey began building his plan piece by piece, quiet and deliberate. Winter crept in, and the streets of Dublin grew darker. Reilly's enemies grew silent, but the quiet wasn't peace. It was the waiting before the storm. Dempsey had disappeared, yes, but ghosts don't stay buried. And when he returned, everyone who thought they understood fear would learn what it truly meant. The weeks after Patsy Cavanagh's murder were eerily quiet. For the first time in years, Dublin's underworld held its breath. Cian Reilly was convinced he had broken the ghost for good. He strutted through the city with an air of invincibility, convinced that silence meant victory. He expanded his reach, took control of new routes, and replaced every one of Dempsey's old contacts with his own men. To outsiders, it looked as though the reign of Liam Dempsey had ended, but in the shadows, far from the noise and the neon lights, the old king was still watching. Dempsey had gone underground in a way few could manage. He moved between safe houses, using only 2 men he trusted absolutely, both of whom owed him their lives. He spent his days piecing together Reilly's new empire, studying its weaknesses. He knew Reilly's arrogance would eventually expose him. All Dempsey needed was a way inside, someone who could feed him information without being noticed. That opportunity arrived in the form of a quiet, unassuming driver named Cian. Cian had once worked for Dempsey years before, handling transport for small runs out of the docks. He was steady, dependable, and invisible, the kind of man no one remembered after he left a room. When Dempsey reached out through one of his old intermediaries, Cian didn't hesitate. He joined Reilly's crew posing as a desperate recruit, someone just looking for steady pay. His story was believable because it was partly true. Reilly barely noticed him. To men like Reilly, drivers were background noise, useful, replaceable, and unimportant. That was exactly what Dempsey needed. From the moment Cian joined, Dempsey began rebuilding his map of Reilly's organization. Through coded messages and burner phones, Cian sent details about Reilly's movements, his meeting spots, and the people closest to him. Dempsey learned that Reilly rarely stayed in one place, that he rotated his cars and homes weekly, and that only a handful of men knew his exact schedule. It was a maze of paranoia, but even the most cautious men make mistakes when they start to believe they're untouchable. The more Cian observed, the more cracks appeared. Reilly's men were loyal to money, not to him. They stole from shipments, underreported profits, and quietly gambled away their shares. Dempsey saw that the empire Reilly had built wasn't solid. It was hollow, crumbling from within. All it needed was a final push. So Dempsey waited. Each week, he had Cian feed him one more piece of the puzzle. Routes, safe houses, financial ledgers, even the identities of Reilly's accountants. By the end of October, he knew more about Reilly's business than Reilly himself. What he didn't want was a street battle that would only bring attention and chaos. He wanted one clean strike, swift, final, unforgettable. When Cian discovered that Reilly would be meeting his accountant in a secluded rural property outside Meath, Dempsey knew the time had come. Months of silence had built to this one moment. No public shootout, no spectacle, just precision and closure. Dempsey spent the night before the hit alone, going over every detail. There would be no mistakes, no witnesses, no survivors. The ghost was done waiting. It was time to remind Dublin's underworld that even in the dark, he was still watching, and when he struck, it was always with purpose. The morning of the hit was cold and gray, the kind of morning when the air felt heavy and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A thin fog clung to the countryside outside Meath, wrapping the narrow roads and quiet fields in a pale silence. Cian Reilly's convoy moved slowly along the winding lanes, 3 cars in total. He sat in the middle vehicle, half asleep, unaware that every turn he took had already been mapped out by the man he thought was long gone. The meeting that day was meant to be routine, a quiet conversation with his accountant about cash movements and new investments. Reilly had become increasingly paranoid over the past few weeks. He had stopped trusting phones, changed drivers twice, and refused to tell anyone where he was headed until the last minute. Yet despite all his precautions, the danger was already beside him. His driver, Cian, the man who had driven him for months without suspicion, was leading him straight into the trap. Hours earlier, Cian had met with Dempsey in a deserted car park. There were no words exchanged, only a brief nod and a shared understanding. Dempsey had planned everything with his usual precision. 2 vehicles positioned near the meeting point, no unnecessary men, no distractions, every move was timed down to the minute. Once Cian confirmed Reilly's route, there was no turning back. When the convoy arrived at the secluded property, a quiet house surrounded by open land and empty sheds, the fog was beginning to lift. Cian pulled the car to a stop at the front gate, pretending to check the lock. The other vehicles lined up behind him. For a few seconds, everything was still. Then it began. 2 dark vans appeared from behind a hedgerow, boxing in Reilly's convoy with brutal efficiency. The first van cut off the road ahead. The second blocked the exit behind. Before anyone could react, the silence shattered with the sound of suppressed gunfire. It was over in seconds. 3 shots, perfectly placed, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. Cian trigger, Reilly never even had time to reach for his weapon. Cian stepped away as the chaos unfolded, calm and expressionless. Dempsey's men moved like clockwork, retrieving what they needed and leaving nothing behind that could be traced. Within minutes the entire scene was empty again, just the faint smell of gunpowder and the sound of wind pushing through the trees. When the Gardaí arrived hours later, the vehicles were still running, doors open, engines humming in the silence. It was a massacre without noise, a crime without witnesses. News of the hit spread before noon. Phones buzzed across Dublin, and fear rippled through every corner of the city. No one had expected Dempsey to return so cleanly, so completely. The message was unmistakable. The ghost was back, and he hadn't forgotten. By nightfall, Reilly's network began to unravel. Associates vanished, money disappeared, and the men who once bragged about standing with Reilly suddenly refused to speak his name. Dempsey didn't surface, didn't claim credit, didn't need to. The city already knew. The ghost didn't just win. He erased his enemy so completely that even his name became a warning. The morning after Cian Reilly's death, Dublin felt different. The city was quieter, slower, as if everyone knew something had shifted but couldn't quite say what. Word of the hit spread fast, whispered first in pubs, then through burner phones, and finally through the streets like smoke. Nobody wanted to say Liam Dempsey's name out loud, but everyone was thinking it. The ghost had returned, and in a single surgical strike, he had ended a war before it truly began. Reilly's empire, which had been built on chaos and fear, began to collapse almost immediately. Without their leader, his men turned on each other, each one desperate to protect himself. Some fled the country overnight, vanishing to Spain or the Netherlands. Others turned informant, trading names and locations for lighter sentences. Within a week, more than a dozen arrests were made as the Gardaí launched Operation Crossfire, a coordinated crackdown on both sides of the Underworld divide. Detectives raided homes, warehouses, and front businesses. They seized cash, weapons, and documents, but what they didn't find was Liam Dempsey. His name appeared again and again in reports and interviews, but there was no trace of him, no phone calls, no sightings, no witnesses willing to admit they'd seen his face. He had vanished as if he had never existed. The Gardaí began to doubt whether he had even been in the country at all. Some officers believed Reilly's death was an inside job, orchestrated by someone from his own ranks. Others were convinced it was Dempsey's work, a final masterpiece from a man who never left evidence behind. In the criminal world, silence is often more powerful than violence, and Dempsey's silence was deafening. His remaining crew went underground, taking no chances. Those who had once betrayed him tried to make amends, but it was too late. They lived in constant fear, waiting for the moment they'd see his shadow again. For months, Dublin's underworld froze, afraid to make a move without knowing whether the ghost was still watching. The Gardaí's investigation uncovered pieces of a much larger puzzle: offshore accounts linked to Dempsey's old operations, coded ledgers hidden in construction firms, and a trail of laundered money stretching across Europe. Yet even with all that, Dempsey himself remained a phantom. Interpol was notified, and his name was placed on several watch lists, but nothing came of it. He had disappeared too cleanly. Meanwhile, Reilly's organization completely disintegrated. His remaining lieutenants fought over scraps of territory, and within months, most were either imprisoned or dead. Dublin's north side, once loud and volatile under Reilly's rule, fell into uneasy silence. Fear had replaced ambition. No one wanted to be the next name whispered in connection to the ghost. By early the next year, the Gardaí closed several open cases, citing lack of evidence. Reilly's murder officially remained unsolved, though everyone in the city already knew who was responsible. Dempsey's legend grew with every retelling, the invisible hand that had restored order through one perfect, merciless act. Yet behind the myth, there was still one lingering truth. No one had actually seen Liam Dempsey since that November morning. Some said he had finally left Ireland, living quietly under a false name. Others believed he was still there, hidden among the people he once ruled. Whatever the truth was, the effect was the same. His absence became a shadow that hung over Dublin's underworld, a silent reminder that even in disappearance, the ghost was still in control. Years passed, but the story of Liam, the ghost Dempsey, never truly faded. His name became something whispered rather than spoken, a warning rather than a memory. New criminals rose through the ranks, but none managed to reach the quiet power that Dempsey once held. The city changed. New faces, new money, new ways of moving drugs and laundering profits, but the fear he had created lingered like a chill that wouldn't leave the air. Every time a young gangster tried to make a name for himself, someone would eventually lean close and say, "Remember what happened to Trigger Reilly." Dublin's underworld had rebuilt itself, but the scars of that single brutal hit remained. No one dared operate with the same arrogance Reilly once showed. There were fewer public feuds, fewer flashy displays of wealth. Even years later, the older generation still used Dempsey's story as a lesson in discipline, a reminder that true power was silent, patient, and always watching. Detectives who had worked the Reilly case still spoke about it in hushed tones. They described it as the cleanest gangland execution Ireland had ever seen. There were no loose ends, no witnesses, no digital trail. Every lead led to a dead end, and every suspect vanished before questioning. Some of the younger officers doubted Dempsey had ever existed at all, believing his legend had grown bigger than the man himself. Others were certain he was alive, living somewhere along the coast under a different name, quietly investing the fortune he'd built in the shadows. Occasionally, a rumor would surface, a sighting in Marbella, a property purchase in Galway, a man matching Dempsey's description seen dining alone in a quiet restaurant in Cork. None of it was ever confirmed. Still, those who had known him best believed he was far too careful to ever come out of hiding. He had done what no one else had ever managed, built an empire, disappeared without a trace, and left behind only a legend. The Gardaí still kept a file on him, marked active, unknown location. It gathered dust in a cabinet, revisited only when a new detective decided to try and make sense of the myth. Each time, they came to the same conclusion, that Dempsey's strength had never been violence alone. It was his patience, his control, his ability to see 3 moves ahead. He didn't just win the war, he ended it so completely that no one dared start another. For the men who still worked the streets, the ghost was a story they told when business got too loud, or when someone began to believe they were untouchable. His name carried weight, not as a memory of a man, but as a symbol of what happened when ego met discipline. Even after all the years, no one could say exactly where he was or whether he was even alive. But every now and then, someone new would go missing, quietly and without explanation. A debt collector, a thief, a dealer who got too bold, and for a brief moment, Dublin's underworld would fall silent again. No one ever said it aloud, but the thought always crossed their minds. Maybe the ghost never really left at all.